Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish or Catalan, so you have to put up with my English. But it's a great pleasure to be with you, and just hearing those presentations, it's amazing how people have been on exactly the same journey in parallel, that we didn't know each other and what we were doing. And as I've heard this morning, when I got to know Carlos, I realized there's such a lot in common between managing by missions and the philosophy that we've heard about this morning already, and Blueprint's approach and thinking. So what I'm going to do is to talk for maybe about half an hour and then have perhaps 10, 15 minutes for questions, because I'd love to hear thoughts and comments and any challenges you've got about our work. So what I'm going to do is very briefly, what am I going to do? I'm going to very briefly work out how this works. Okay, so this is what I'm going to cover. So what is Blueprint? How did it start? And what do we do? And what have some of the companies that we've been working with done? So the origin of Blueprint was after the financial crisis in 2009, and I helped organize with others a seminar at Schroders Bank with 12 chairs of large banks and other financial institutions. They're all worried that everything had gone wrong, and they didn't know what to do. And one of the chairs said, you know what? We've all gone around asking just two questions. Is it legal? And is it profitable? And if it's both, we've just gone and done it. And then I ended up finding myself working with them on a letter that appeared in the Financial Times in September 2010, which basically said this philosophy of thinking about just is it legal and is it profitable, in the end, fundamentally undermines the basis of trust in the market on which all profitable activity depends. It was a powerful letter, but then the City Values Forum was created to restore the reputation of the City of London. And a few of us said, well, why are you trying to do that? What you're really trying to do is to say we want more trust so that we can make more money out of everybody. So the aim was really self-serving. And a few of us said, well, isn't the bigger question, what's the purpose of the financial sector? Who does it exist to serve? And what struck a number of us was that question just fell on completely deaf ears. And so a group of business leaders, and they came to my former boss, the Archbishop of Westminster. Why did they come to him? Well, because he had done some work in 2009 after Caritas in Veritate, which is an encyclical published by Pope Benedict, and it had a brilliant section on the ethical critique of the market. They came to him because they'd seen that work, and they said, we think you can help us, but it can't be about religion. But we like the value of the common good. We like the value of human dignity. We see that this thinking can help. So that was what happened. And when we started, we had a group of people which drew on business, some business leaders referred to in the firms that we've worked with, but also from philosophy, also from positive psychology, also from behavioral economics. And the starting question was, and we had a year, and the starting question was, what's gone wrong, and what could we do? And the essential analysis was to say, well, as we've heard, two dominant ideas, and it's right, it doesn't go back much, but Milton Friedman was incredibly influential, but there was a world before him. Two dominant ideas have shaped the way in the Anglo-Saxon world most businesses think and act. One idea is that the purpose of business is to maximize profits, and the second idea is that people are best assumed to be self-interested and motivated by money, status, and power. You put those two ideas together, align incentives in the right way, and then people seeking no more than their own self-interest will behave in a way that enables a company to maximize its profits. Business 101. The maths all works. It's beautiful. What's the problem? Well, there are two problems, as we saw it when we looked at this. It creates, as we thought of it, a double disconnect. So one disconnect, which has become very familiar, is the disconnect between business and society, when in pursuit of maximizing profits, as Ghoshal wrote in that paper, basically you don't care about a bunch of other things. Environmental, it's not our problem. Social, not our problem. Tell government to regulate us and we'll change differently. So you create this difference, this gap between business and society. When people look at business, they say, well, they're just trying to make money out of us. They're just trying to exploit us. But there's a profounder and more deeper disconnect, which we thought was super interesting. And as our work goes on, I think this is the more important thing now, which is the disconnect, as I think of it, in the human heart. This is where people feel not connected to the business and not fulfilled through their work. And with the group that we had, very similar to the conversation we've just heard in 2012, we asked the question, so what do we know about human motivation? And what do we know about how human beings are? And the answer is, it doesn't really matter whether you start with Aristotle, or the teachings of the great faiths, or positive psychology, or behavioral economics. Whichever door you go through, you find yourself in the same room. And the same room says, yes, money, status, and power, these matter. Survival matters. We all want these things. But 3 other things are super important to most human beings. One is the desire for meaning, to want to make a contribution through life. The second is we're naturally social. We're not atomized individuals. We care for other people, and we want to be in an environment where we can care and belong to others and be part of an environment and part of a community. And the third thing is that we are never finished. So to be human is to be all the time a being with potential. We're growing through life and through work. And therefore, we seek opportunities to develop, to achieve mastery, to realize our potential through work. And when those impulses are not satisfied, people live divided lives. They leave part of themselves at home. They don't innovate. They're not creative. And you get a whole bunch of scandals as well as people behave in a way that is dysfunctional and destroys the organizations. So we thought, okay, so we had 2 ideas, basically, that profit maximization is a purpose and people are self-interested individuals. These are ideas. These are not laws of physics. They're not the laws of the land, and they're not true. So the 2 better ideas. And the 2 better ideas are, one, that businesses can and should have a reason for being, a purpose at the organizational level to benefit society. And the second idea is that business can operate with a different assumption about human motivation and create the conditions to crowd in intrinsic motivation. And as one CEO we work with has this great phrase, which I use a lot now in our work. He said, when you do that and you create an environment within the organization which is both orientated to the purpose and at the same time respects people, people feel that they are valued members of a winning team on a worthwhile mission. And this is what we've been trying to do. Okay, so when we started, so that's the thinking. So when we started, we set up a charity. Because the business leader said, okay, the way to be useful in the system is to do the opposite of everybody else. Don't be another consulting practice. The world doesn't need another consulting practice. Don't be a kite mark. Don't give people badges, because they'll just want the badges. Don't impose any bureaucracy or compliance burden, because if people want to tell the world how wonderful they are, there are lots of ways they can do that now. They don't need another one. Don't be a judge. Don't put a list of companies on your website. Who are you to judge? And one of them will do something stupid tomorrow, so you have to take them off. So don't do that. Be a catalyst for change. Work with the leaders of large listed companies in the UK to test the hypothesis about what Blueprint's thinking is and see whether you can create a community among leaders of different companies that would enable this to actually fly. So that's what we tried to do. But I should just introduce, before I've done this, the actual core framing of our approach. If I can find the thing. What did I do? The right. There we go. So we produced 2 pieces of paper in 2 years, a very slow production rate. This is the second piece of paper, which we call the 5 principles of a purpose-driven business. And basically, we see this as a relationship map. It's having a purpose in the middle. What brings people together? Why does this business exist? And I love some of the framing we heard earlier from John Frontodano about the change in the mentality of how we think about a company. This starts from the idea that a company is first and foremost a human system. It's not a set of property rights. It is. There are contracts, there are property rights. But fundamentally, it is people. And people who come together to achieve something they cannot achieve alone. And the purpose is the thing in the middle that binds them. This is why we're here. This is what we're here to do together. And the quadrants around are the relationships. They're the relationships on which that business depends. And in our thinking, a purpose-led business, which is motivated both by a purpose at the organizational and a sense of the respect for human dignity, sees itself as one to have a positive impact on the lives of all of those it touches. Not because it'll make more money, instrumentalizing purpose, which is a lot of going on that at the moment, but because we care. We choose to care about the impact we have on people, and we want to have a positive impact. And even though there are very difficult trade-offs that businesses have to make, and some relationships are more material to business success than others, there are always choices, and businesses can always avoid acting manifestly unfairly. Now, that's the second piece of paper we produced. And in 2014, Accenture got excited about this, and they gave us 5 consultants for a week. And they came back with 240 KPIs on this for a business. Beautiful, 40 slides. So we went through that, and we said, do you know what? You can do all of those KPIs and not change how you think about anything. So this doesn't work. So this document is the outcome. It's the shop window for our work, because people look at it, and they say, oh yeah, it's very interesting. But we say, don't start here. Where you need to start from is you need to think about, if I can get this to work, you need to think about what is driving the behavior in the business. So the principles that I just showed you are the bit of the iceberg above the waterline. And then you have to go down and say, what is the behavior that generates those relationships? And in turn, that behavior is shaped by mindset. And is your mindset about what the purpose is and how you think about the quality of relationships that you want to create and sustain that shapes what the business actually does. And so our work is mostly based on mindset. And mindset is super important because I think Christiana Figueres has this lovely quote from her book, Time to Choose, in preparation for the Paris Climate Agreement. Business is a complex adaptive systems. It's a complicated landscape. There are lots and lots of systemic issues. Big companies are big systems. But the one thing we have control of in any approach to a business decision and how we work is our mindset, what frame of mind we bring to it. Okay, so I've talked a bit about, I should have said at the beginning, I'm not reading my talk, as you can tell, but I have written one. And if it's useful, I'm very happy to, I've already given it to Carlos. So if anybody's interested in what I meant to say rather than what you're hearing, it's all written here. So you have that view, fine. You think about these 2 aspects. So what do? 5 people, you try and have an influence on a huge company. How does that work? So when we start, one of our advisors, I said to her, how do we fail? It's always a good question to ask somebody. How do we fail? She said, Charles, you fail by delivering phony catharsis. That's a translator's challenge. Phony catharsis. In other words, you make people feel better, but they all go back to work and completely forget about it because they've got 500 emails and, lovely talk, love it, but it doesn't make a blind bit of difference. So that's the problem. That's how you fail. That's how I fail. I go away feeling better. I thought it was a great conversation, but nothing happens. So how do you de-risk that? And one of my colleagues came up with this brilliant idea. She said, okay, what we should do is create social contracts. Social, no money, no legals, but it's an intentional agreement to work over 2 to 3 years with the leadership team of a large company who says they like this thinking. And then the commitment from their part is that they will spend time. So we will do sessions with the exco. We will do sessions with the boards. I see the CEOs every 10 weeks, one-to-one for an hour. That's a big commitment of time on their part. It's a coaching, accompanying approach. We bring the CEOs together in groups of 3 or 4, 3 times a year for 2 hours. We also do the same with HR directors and heads of sustainability, because what we find is that the best people to help somebody who's struggling with this is somebody doing the same job in another business. And they're super good at challenging each other as well. Very, very good bullshit detection. And because we're a charity, we're not trying to sell anything, we can create a safe, neutral space for people to explore. So that's what we do. And so what happens then in our work with companies, if you're 5 people, you're working with CEOs and exos, what actually happens? So when we go in, often, people have been writing a purpose statement. They're just about to, or they're doing it, and they want to show it to you. So I say, well, why are you doing that? And they say, well, we should have a purpose. Everybody's getting a purpose. We thought we should have a purpose. So I said, what's the problem that having a purpose statement is going to solve? What's going to be different about your business other than the wallpaper? And by the way, if you have new wallpaper which says, here's our purpose, and people see the same behavior, all you've done is to create cognitive dissonance in the organization. You've done the opposite of what you actually are intending to do. So then what happens is that we try to get them to stop doing whatever they were doing and to have a space for a reflective conversation. And using the methodology of Nancy Klein, who wrote that wonderful book called Time to Think, we create an environment around a simple but quite profound question. It might be, so what for you in this executive team actually is the relationship between purpose and profit? How do you actually personally think about that? What would you love your legacy to be when you leave this company? in 10 years' time, if you were really passionate about being part of this company, why would that be? What would this company really have to be and do for that to be true? And then what we do with Nancy Klein's methodology is we give them maybe one of these questions, right? And then 5 minutes of silence, which they're not used to. We say, keep away from your phone, 5 minutes. And then, around the table conversation, everybody gets 3 minutes. No more, no less. No comment, no disagreement, listen. And what's amazing, you do that with a group of very senior people with a good question. And the CEO says to the CFO, I never knew you thought that. They said, well, nobody's ever asked. And you have this extraordinary conversation, which often just does not happen. That's the thing that amazed me. I thought this happened all the time, but it doesn't. Because people are very busy, they're in their silos, they're doing their jobs, they don't stand back together. And then what we try and do, and this is important where the CEO has to stand back and not be dominant, because this can get in the way. It's very difficult for people to be very honest, especially if they disagree with the strategy or they see there's a barrier which is not really being faced into. We try and create the space for things that are hard to be said. So why won't this work? It would be lovely to be a purpose-led business, but let me tell you, the people in this organization would never have it. These are barriers here. Our investors would never buy it. And you try and bring to the surface all the barriers. And then you work through those, and you think about what might change. And you create an inspiration and a desire within the organization for something different. And then what is also very important is the quality of dialogue internally and with stakeholders when you start thinking about that. And then what then happens is that you've spent a while, and sometimes we've spent over a year with leadership teams who've come to then, and sometimes their people change as well, who come to a strong view about what they want to achieve, and they're passionate about it. And what they then, the next mistake is, well, this is brilliant. So we send everybody needs to be inspired next Monday. And they send something in an old command and control mentality to the rest of the organization, expecting them all to do what they've spent a year working out. And I think this is a real issue for purpose in large organizations, because the shift in thinking is very hard over time. Unilever, who we work with, Keith Weed, who was their CMO, said, Charles, in our experience, this was a layer a year within Unilever to try and get this shift of thinking in large businesses to change. And Carlos and I were talking last night about another risk is that you get this wonderful language of purpose being talked at the C-suite and in the board, completely removed from what's going on in the middle, where there's a completely different conversation going on. And the reason we say at the top, you have to become to a very clear, shared understanding, is that if you don't, and all just use the language of purpose, but mean different things by it, all you do is you transmit ambiguity down into the system. And the guy in the middle says, well, he wants my purpose, but the other guy's just saying, here are my sales targets. Which is the most important? How do these two things fit together? So there's dissonance in the organization unless you really try and do that well. So, and we also believe that in our work that you can't create a purpose-led organization through an old command and control style. There's no McKinsey manual that 600 pages takes you from here to there, to these 20 things, and it will all happen. Because it's about mindset change, because these are complex adaptive systems and require sensing and changing. So what have we seen? I'm just going to give you a few things that I've seen organizations do in our experience in order to try and avoid that trap. One is to identify a specific business challenge. And this is, where our work, I think, links a lot with what you've done with the work on missions in functional level. Identify a business challenge to solve and inviting people in. So there's a genuine co-creative process around a specific thing. Making some bold moves helps, especially if they cost money. I actually, to Gareth's point, if you move from a purpose to maximize profit to a purpose to benefit society, in my experience of big companies, there's always going to be at least one thing you should stop. It's lovely to think there's always a win-win, but I don't think there is. So there will be some things. For instance, a bank. One of the banks was, they were making a load of money out of unauthorized overdrafts. And somebody looked at the data and said, do you know what? We're making 50% of our profits out of people who are incapable of managing their own money. Very profitable. Purposeful? So essentially making a load of money out of people who are not very good at managing their own. So a purpose-led bank might stop doing that. They say that's just bad profits. We could, but we're not going to. And then you have to innovate into other forms of revenue generation, which are purposeful. So I think when you move in big organizations that make this shift, there are lots of ways there. Sales targets, commission-based selling, lots and lots of examples I'm sure you can all think of where big companies exploit rather than genuinely serve their customers. So this shift often does pose a big challenge. So thinking about that, and also that stakeholder map that I presented earlier, the relationship map, what some of the companies we do work with, and I think this is again similar to the missions approach, is look at the stakeholder lens through each decision and say, how could that be different? Looking and become very curious about examples of great practice where people have seen. So during COVID, in fact it was the bank, NatWest Group particularly, that did this. Lots of work, remote working. And what they did with their learning and development team was to look at new patterns of work that had evolved. In some cases, quite good ones. In some cases, not so good. And they just got very curious about what it was that had enabled a liberating pattern of work, remote work, to arise. And tried to learn from that. And then try and keep that after the pandemic. So I think learning from that kind of experience is very, very helpful. And then creating internal dialogue about a number of issues, particularly what you measure and how you measure it. Big companies love measuring everything. And if you say purpose, they say, okay, let's have a KPI. So these big companies are all getting KPI'd now on ESG metrics for board members and directors. There's a saying in our work, it's not original to us at all, but I think it's really powerful, which is what counts is what gets counted, but what really counts can't be counted. I don't believe you can measure purpose directly. I do believe we need to develop much better proxy measures for non-financial outcomes, but we need to be very careful about the idea that somehow there's a data solution and a measurement solution to the shift that we're talking about, this paradigm shift, because I don't believe there is. I think there's a human shift. And when people say, well, what do you mean by that? I say, have you got any children? Often they do. I say, well, how do you know what your relationship is like with your children? Do you put a number to it? Well, no. But you know how you're getting on with your kids. And there are all these ways in human terms that we do know about the quality of our relationships. And we don't necessarily need to put numbers to them. We need stories, we need narratives, and sometimes we do need numbers. But I think that that's a really interesting thing. So a lot of our work is about that. And I think, if I think of what we're really trying to do with these big companies, I'll tell you one other thing about COVID, which one of our advisors said. We had a dinner 2 weeks ago with 6 FTSE 100 CEOs. And this is a woman called Margaret Heffernan, who's a writer, she's brilliant. And they were talking about what the pandemic and how the good things that had happened for their company, how it had motivated people, they cared for people, supported their customers, their suppliers. And she said, okay, that's good. But you know the game of Jenga, the wooden game where you build a tower and you can take bricks out? So she said, so why did it take the pandemic for you to do all these things that have released the energy of people? Wasn't that energy there before? Why did you wait till the pandemic came along before you did all these things, at which they all got slightly deflated? And then she said, if you think of the business as a game of Jenga and you've taken some bricks out, how many more bricks could you take out without the structure falling over and the business falling over? How many more things in your big companies, processes, structures, tools, that, as somebody described it, create learned organizational helplessness, could you actually remove that would free people to bring their best selves to work, to be super excited about being valued members of a winning team on a worthwhile mission? So that, I think, is a great challenge. And I think the point about, there are other things in my paper which I've not talked about in terms of system shift. I just want to say a bit about what some of the companies have done. But I think this idea of a company as a system and a human system is very important. And there's one definition which I found the other day, I can't remember now who made it, of a system as being a self-reinforcing process of collective belief formation. A self-reinforcing process of collective belief formation. So that if you create new habits of behavior within a business, virtue ethics, character formation, so that people then see different things happening regularly, you then build the belief, because there's so much cynicism in business, and understandable cynicism, And it's so easy for CEOs to tell a beautiful story about purpose and for people in the middle not to feel any difference. And that's part of the problem now, because the language of purpose is becoming rife. And it's outstripping the pace at which this deep change is happening, although the deep change is happening in some places. But I think it's the self-reinforcing process of collective belief formation. So you're forming people's beliefs about what the business is really doing, what's our genuine purpose, and what do we really believe about people and what motivates them. And I think this is the key. And Margaret Heffernan, also at the same dinner, challenged the business leaders who were there, because she said, how does change really happen in big companies? And what do leaders really need to see if they're going to move? And the answer she gave, which I think is very powerful, what is needed is social contagion. A business leader, where if they see another business leader like them doing something, will move. Oh, if they're doing it, well, why didn't you tell me before? Of course I'll do it. And that's how we all are. We have people we like and admire whose opinion of what we do matters a lot. And this is very true in the business world. And if there's kind of permission given for leaders to move, then people will. And it takes courage for the early adopters to be very visible about what they're doing differently, how they're really trying to reset their business, and why. And that's a very, very important part, particularly now, I think, coming out of COVID, where there is a risk, I think, for lots of reasons of insecurity, for some of these gains of thinking to be lost. Right, so my last bit, I'm going to give you 5 examples of what businesses have actually done, and then we can have 50-minute Q&A, all right? So one thing, a good purpose creates a gap between where we are now and where we want to go. So if you think of BP, Helge Lund became the chair of BP in 2019. Their purpose, as he said, was then to maximize shareholder value. So they created, with consultation with shareholders, a new purpose to reimagining energy for the future of people and planet. They appointed Bernard Looney as CEO on the basis of that purpose as the best person to transform the business. They got a huge job. That's a massive job. He set some 2030 targets, which is good, because I've seen some CEOs who commit to net zero setting 2050 targets. In other words, for their successors, but not for them. So he's been good. He's saying, okay, we're going to do this in my tenure, 40%. Huge. So I think a good purpose, extreme in that case, but in other organizations, creates this gap between what the desired purpose takes you to become and where you are now. And that can be used and should be used to energize. It's a creative tension. And I think is very powerful in lots of businesses. We've seen that in different ways. I think the second thing it does is it creates a mentality of genuine partnership. And we worked in 2017 with Anglo American, big mining company, good in their sector. And one of the things that struck me listening to them and working with them was that their business depends on the local communities and where they have mines. They can be kicked out of the countries. They depend on all these relationships. And what they realized and wanted to make more explicit was that as a really responsible mining company, they wanted the communities to share completely in the value generated rather than it being value extraction. So a test was, when the mine closes in 60 years, will this country and the community be glad we were here? Have we created value for them and infrastructure and benefits that will last? So there's a mutuality there of benefit. And the mutuality is a genuine shared value. It's a true mutual value. And it's a big part of in a world where most business assets are intangible. An awful lot of it is the business equivalent of friendship, I think. In other words, it's what's the mutual thing that arises when people commit to each other and try and create something beyond themselves. So that. The third thing is fairness. So we've seen a number of organizations we work with. The word fair occurs 5 times in our principles. And the best businesses have always tried to be fair. And that's partly how they got a good reputation. But one of the companies we work with employs 60,000 people, a lot in call centers. In 2019, they made a commitment to pay the real living wage, which is a pay rise for a lot of their poor paid people, in April 2020. COVID hits. They lose a lot of money. But they interestingly fulfill that commitment with the agreement of more senior staff who took pay cuts. I thought, gosh, that's quite an interesting commitment to have made. And a lot of companies that are embracing this way of thinking think very hard about their supply chain. What are our payment days for small suppliers? They have this asymmetry of power of big companies. How are we using that? So fairness becomes a very a very important part. There's loads to do on pay, particularly, but several companies we work with have, if not equalized pay, they certainly haven't done that, but they have said, it doesn't matter what your salary is, but the percentage of the pension contribution should be the same. We should be contributing the same to everybody's pension in this business as a percentage of salary. So you get that kind of shift, I think. And then I think that in the paper, I'll talk a bit about collective action. I think that's there too. But I'm going to just skip over that and talk a little bit about dialogue and inclusion. If a business is a human system, a genuinely human system, it has to be characterized by true dialogue all the time. And it becomes a characteristic and a feature of an organization. Now, one of the things that was fascinating in the last 2 years was what big businesses did in the UK after the George Floyd murder and the conversations around racism and Black Lives Matter. And a number of CEOs put out statements, they consulted internally, and a lot found it very hard to hear what came back to them. I mean, one company we work with, the CEO told me his CTO is black, and he put something out. The CTO came to see him and said, can I talk to you about what you put out? He said, yeah, sure. He said, let me tell you about my life. He said, I earn a lot of money in this business. I'm black. I live in South London. I have a Mercedes. If I drive to see my mother in North London, I get stopped by the police very regularly because I'm a black man in an expensive car. Oh. And then there was lots of other conversations like that and around the implicit, subtle, institutional ways in which companies, without wanting to, reinforce social injustice. And I think this is a really interesting thing because what then happens is that once people have true dialogue and they become aware, then you have a choice. Because then you're either consciously complicit in reinforcing the status quo or you become an agent of change. And it goes with the thought that purpose-led businesses need diversity and need to include different perspectives if you're going to create a relationship-based business that understands that. So I've seen that as a very interesting example of the way the desire for dialogue, respecting the dignity of people, has changing the track, and diversity and inclusion is becoming a very key way, and I'm sure it is for the businesses that you're involved with, in resetting and helping to advance this paradigm shift that we've all been talking about. So I wouldn't want you to think from those examples that every business we work with suddenly becomes purpose-led and it's all beautiful. 5 minutes.
10 minutes.
I'll try and do 5. I went to I was asked by the chairman of an extremely profitable company to come and talk to his board and executive. Actually, it was the executive, first of all. They're all earning incredible amounts and have done very, very well. And I could just tell that what I was saying was landing completely on deaf ears. The first question was, Charles, what's in it for us? You tell me all this societal stuff. How are we going to make more money doing that? How is this? It's exactly the same question in another way that you had with your group about why there was that mentality in spades. We're here to make money. What else could and just tell me how you think we can do more of that. There was no So you think, okay, that's where that lot are. Their board were actually interestingly a bit more divided, but there was genuine interest in the board. And I think this goes to the point about why this is shifting that Gertz talked about earlier, that societal expectations are changing. Even businesses that are very profit-driven realize that the world is now expecting more and different things from them. But I think where I would say, maybe I'd just say a word about this, is it a fad or the future? What I've seen from my experience, and it is a limited number, we're a small charity, we work with people who are interested in working with us, so I don't want to generalize too much. But I definitely think there is a generational change. There's a rising number of employees. Employee power, I think, is a big factor in this. And also, obviously, the huge systemic pressures we're under. I think the reality of climate change, the fact that we do not have time, and businesses, we might prefer a world that was better countervailing powers, that companies didn't have as much power and were more accountable. But the fact is, we don't have time to change the constitution of all these countries. And the reality is that companies have massive power and agency in the system. And they have responsibility. And they have choices. So I think people are increasingly going to look to companies. And also, when you think about Ukraine, you think about the delicacy and the awful tragedy that's in the world, the role of business in helping to reinforce and carry values and to enable a just transition. Because the climate thing is not going to happen unless we have a just transition to it. So you cannot have the E without the S. This does not work. And companies have to step up. And I think the pressure on them to do it and to engage appropriately in politics is going to be bigger and bigger, and needs to be. So I too think that this is a need. Purpose is a need for businesses to have to play the role that they need to have. I think, in summary, I would say I think it's liberating when company directors realize. We had a speech from John Kay, who's an Edmonton economist. He said, "The scales fell from my eyes when I realized that it was not the job of a director of a company to maximize anything. It's not. It's their job to balance. It's their job to make balanced decisions." And this little word maximize that often says, oh yeah, we'll maximize profits and purpose, we need to lose. It doesn't help. I'd also lose the word capitalism, by the way, because I don't think that helps either in Europe. I don't use the word capitalism at all. I just ask, what's the role of business in society? That doesn't work when you go to America. I went to America and said that. Somebody said, "What do you mean you're not a capitalist?" And I said, well, what do you mean by being a capitalist? He said, "It just means I'm not a communist, Charles. Get over it." So that's the American mentality is a bit different. But I think in Europe, it doesn't help, because what it does is it signals that any business in the private sector has to put money ahead of people. That's what people often ideologically think capitalism is. And I know that in the businesses that we work with, we've got brilliant people who don't believe that, who believe that this is really human-centered and want businesses to be places of human thriving. But the last thing I would say is that while I think there are tools, and we need to develop more tools, and good consultants and businesses that are tracking this, I don't believe in the end that we get to purpose-led business other than through the human heart. In other words, it only comes from the commitment and the choices that we decide to make about how we show up and we want to achieve through our work. And that's difficult. And that's why this is not going to be for granted. But it's possible, but it's just a human solution, not a technocratic solution. Okay, well, I'll stop there. I hope that makes some kind of sense. So some questions. I'm sorry, it's a lot to take in, and in English, and you've had 2 presentations already, and there's coffee out there. So, but if anybody has any questions on anything I've said, Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles. It's been fantastic. I love what you said, that you can measure purpose. I love it. But then arises a question, how can we, what is the alternative? How can we know that we are making progress?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer. And the way I think about this is that the executive teams and the boards that we work with are using our 5 principles. They're saying, okay, we're committed to these relationships, so we need to know what they are. And so they do try and produce good proxies for various aspects of things. I mean, employee relationships is in a way easy, although a lot of the measures about that tend to be gamed and are not very good. But there are some measures around that. We do need to create better measures for the social impact of our products and services. So what is different about somebody's life? Okay, I've sold them, if you're Vodafone and you're selling a mobile phone, someone comes into a shop, an old lady comes into the shop. You could sell her, because she doesn't know any different, the most expensive iPhone. Or you could listen to her and say, all you need is this one, which will cost you a third of the one I could make my commission on. But actually, you're genuinely serving her rather than making the most money for the company. Now, how do you assess the mental shift that enables a sales assistant in a shop to genuinely care about that? Now, that's hard. So Marcus Seif, when he was running Marks and Spencer's, this is in the 1980s, apparently, it's a big UK retailer, Marks and Spencer's, so he was forensic in looking at product margins on product lines. So he would go around and he would be curious when they were very low. But he would also be curious when they're very high. And he'd say, so what's the story here? Are we paying our suppliers too little? Are we charging our customers too much? And he would want a balance. A balance. He didn't want to maximize. He wanted a balance because he wanted a relationship and not a transaction. So we have to look, I think, in a very granular way at what our business is, what do we really do, what are these granular decisions that people are making, and what do we really want those decisions to be, and then work from there. And I think a lot of it is about devolution of responsibility as well. And so you give authority to where the information is. And so if you want a purpose-led set of shops, I would give lots of authority to the shop manager. Not the head office, forget them. But that shop manager who talks to those assistants every day, he sees that old woman coming in and he sees her go out. So what did you sell her? And why did you sell that? And I think that's the way to do this. Much, much more decentralization. It's complicated, though. Any other pre-coffee questions? Yes, at the back. A lady at the back. If you don't mind speaking English, yo no hablo español. Could you have a microphone? Yeah.
We spoke about, thanks a lot. We spoke about human heart. Why don't we use the word spirituality? Because to me, that's fundamental.
That's a great question. Why don't we use the word spirituality? So, I was very nervous. In the first time I used this, which was with an exco of the NatWest Group in 2018, one of the first meetings we had with them, I did use the phrase, the disconnect in the human heart. That was the first time I had said that phrase to an exco of a big company. And I didn't know how it would go, because it's a strange thing to say. Even that is a strange thing to say in a business environment. I found out later that the CMO of the bank was really struck by that. It was that phrase that resonated with him. He said, yeah, what this guy is saying is true, and deeply true. And I think in all our work in this area, the question is to find bridging language that connects with people's experience and enables them to take the next step on an exploration of what could be different. The word spirituality, certainly in the UK context, I think is problematic because it is too closely aligned in people's thinking with religion. And religion is very problematic. So, and I come from an environment where I've worked as an accountant and I spent a lot of time working in what I think of now as the God business, so in the church. But and when we started Blueprint, I got this advice that we should use, because I said, we've drawn on Catholic social teaching. We're working with secular businesses. How should we think about this? How should we discuss this? And it was Louise James, who was a colleague. I knew she was an atheist from Accenture. That's why I asked her. I said, how do you think, Louise, we should do this? She said, Charles, I would just talk about Blueprint's work being faith-enabled, but not faith-led. It's faith-enabled. So if you happen to be a person of faith, of any faith, it's great to see phrases like the common good and respect for human dignity and solidarity and subsidiarity and to feel a resonance with those. But you don't, in our work, have to have there's no assumption about any underlying metaphysical beliefs to use those concepts and ideas. They're incomplete, of course they are. And for all of us, the search for meaning then takes you deeper. But in our work, we're just part of a bridge. And I think for what we are doing, you have to have language that is familiar enough for people to not feel alienated by it or to think that there's a hidden agenda that you've got. You know, underneath Blueprint, you're all trying to turn us into Catholics. And there isn't. It's just a framing which uses thinking, uses the riches of these traditions in a way that is liberating and creates better quality dialogue. And the Viktor Frankl work, which you talked about, is absolutely brilliant for this. And so we talk quite a lot about meaning, actually. And all these are very close, aren't they? Spirituality, meaning, purpose, personal purpose. And the thought that there's a deeper meaning in our lives that work should be at the service of is a very, very important part of this, I think. It's just that we're feeling our way. At the moment, I don't use that not that I don't believe it, it's not that. It's a question of what language is going to be useful.